Thanks, Peter. Island Innovation is a global network connecting islands that may have similar issues. And for me, energy is one of the most fundamental facing all islands around the world. Places like the Caribbean, the cost of electricity may be 3 to 6 times higher than people pay in Florida. Within the US states, guess which has the highest rate of electricity? Hawaii. And this applies right around the world. From my own country in the UK, the Scottish Islands have the highest levels of energy poverty in the country, to the Pacific and Asia. And so islands share this common energy experience, and particularly I'm talking about electricity. This really impacts all areas of development. How can you be effective in manufacturing if you have high cost of electricity, for example, and can be a real barrier to development. And so renewable energy represents not only an important environmental effort, but actually impacts all sectors of the economy, because for most islands, renewables is actually the cheapest option. So if we want to talk purely about economics, we can look at the optimum renewable energy rate for most islands being anywhere from 50 to 90%. So I'm going to give a bit of context around why I think the island energy conversation is so important and what this means for the wider renewable energy and electricity grid conversation. So to start off, many of you may be familiar with Puerto Rico and know the issues that Puerto Rico had after Hurricane Maria, which I guess is 3, 4, 5 years ago now. Hurricane Maria hit the island and wiped out the grid. And this is what happens when you have an old-fashioned electricity grid that has not been updated. And this was a really interesting opportunity for Puerto Rico to rebuild almost from scratch because the grid had been wiped out. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. Through various political and economic efforts I won't go into now, the effort was slow to rebuild. But what it does show is that if you were to build an electricity grid from scratch, it would not look like the electricity grids that we have today, because most the way that the technology has evolved has means that the cheapest and best options that we have today are not reflective of the existing infrastructure. A really good example of this is looking at, or this leapfrogging effect, is looking at telecommunications in sub-Saharan Africa. Most people in Africa, and I'm being very general about the continent, so let's say Kenya. Most people, almost everyone in Kenya owns a mobile phone, but most Kenyans don't have a landline installed in their house, because why do you need it? Most people now are really, the landline exists in the house is redundant. And we kind of see that same leapfrogging effect that could take place in the energy sector as well. So there are 3 fundamental questions that I kind of want to address in my brief talk to you today. 1, why is energy so important for islands, which I've already gone into. 2, what trends can we see in energy for islands? And 3, the question of 100% renewables and what is an effective level of renewables for islands. So I've covered that first question, why is energy so important for islands? And I guess it's really important to underline that most islands around the world today still get a bulk of their energy or electricity from diesel generators, to the point that in many parts of the Caribbean, the GDP spent on importing fuels can be as high as 20 or 30%. Imagine 20 or 30% of GDP spent on importing fuels. So moving to renewables can have multiple really big benefits if you take a region like the Caribbean. 1, reducing the cost of electricity, which I mentioned. 2, increasing the resilience to hurricanes, to storms. That's a really interesting one. Clearly, solar panels and hurricanes don't go well together. But actually, if you look at the engineering and the efforts that have been done around this, hurricanes in the Caribbean are now being built to a level that means that they can withstand the vast majority of hurricanes. Clearly, a direct impact from anything is difficult. But the big difference that goes back to the Puerto Rico discussion is that solar panels will be distributed across an island, across a wider area with multiple different farms in different places. So if one is taken out, you still have other plants around the place generating, and maybe you have wind, you could even have ocean energy generating. Puerto Rico had pretty much all of its energy being located, all of its electricity being generated on one corner of the island. And when a hurricane made direct contact with that, it wiped out the generation for across the whole island. And so the idea of moving towards a decentralized grid for somewhere for islands is an exciting opportunity. The reason that I'm kind of emphasizing some of these points is that what is happening on islands, I think, is an indicator of what the future of electricity grids looks like on mainland areas. You see these extreme pressures due to the high prices and various other factors that are really a microcosm of what could be happening to energy in general. As the price of oil goes up across the coming decades, obviously renewables will continue to become more competitive. And what is happening now, looking at small island communities, is really a petri dish to think about what the utility of the future can look like for really large scale utilities. A really interesting case study, I think, is the utility death spiral that you've hopefully heard of before in the island context. Let's take an island, the Turks and Caicos Islands, just south of the Bahamas. For several years, the only the only solar panels on the island were on the utilities offices. They were the only place that was allowed to actually install them. And the reason for that is that the utility obviously knew that renewables represented a good option for them to generate cheaper electricity, but they obviously did not want to give up the right to that. And that you see this struggle happening across the whole region, and governments responding in really different ways in their policy. One interesting example is also in Curacao in the Dutch Caribbean. The government there implemented what was branded as a solar tax, really just a way for the utility to keep some control over who was installing solar and keep some of the benefits of that. And I won't go into the utility economics details there, but what will happen and is happening in some islands is that wealthier people install solar, go off grid, and we see this downward spiral as more people go off grid. Fewer people are then in the customer base, and the price goes up. And if you have a customer base of 30,000 people, maybe less than 10,000 households, it doesn't take a lot of people to go off grid for it to get quite scary and have potentially national consequences. So the policy efforts that are being made are very, very different across very different islands. And so there's been some really examples of bad policy that has had a detrimental effect, some examples of policy that has not been communicated well to the public, and some examples which remain to be seen which are the most successful, but I'm sure there will be examples of good policy that can then be taken and learned from. Now, obviously, COVID has thrown a spanner in the works for this experiment, given that one of the main uses of electricity in many islands goes to tourism. And so that has really impacted utilities in a big way. But I think it will be interesting to see how this does evolve for many different islands in this process of adopting renewables. Now, the final point I had on my list was this idea of 100% renewables. So the reason I bring that up is politicians love 100%. It's a great way. No politician is going to stand on the stage and say, we want 95% renewables. It doesn't have that ring to it. And so what's really interesting for me, I'm clearly not an engineer. I'm working with the utilities, the governments, local NGOs, universities, and seeing how all these different players are communicating and thinking about renewables and how they interact with each other. And what is really clear is that the average person in the street does not have time to have a detailed conversation about utility economics. And so these branded phrases like 100% renewables or a solar tax or a sun tax are ways that grab the public's attention and sometimes lead to less than optimal decisions being taken at the policy level. And so 100% renewables sounds great on paper, but let's face it, the economic optimum is going to be anywhere from 40 to 95%, depending on what the local conditions are. And I think what's really key is that islanders that already have this really high cost of electricity should be aiming for that optimum and not for the 100%, because whatever is going to be cheapest on that, the carbon emissions of these islands are negligible in the global sense. And so it's really important to focus on that economic optimum. Now, one of the interesting elements is that this is often balanced with the tourism or branding element, that the green brand is more and more important for many of these islands. And so that does play into it. And if you're already at 99%, then maybe you want to try and reach that 100%. But the reality is that we all know that that last 5 or 10% is rarely economic to achieve in most cases. But that hasn't stopped politicians from making these promises. And so over the last 10 years, we've seen a slew of islands around the world commit to 100% renewables. And to my knowledge, none of those have actually been maintained, unfortunately. My favorite example is a small island in the South Pacific called Tokelau. Only 1,500 people, so a relatively small place. To get there, which I have tried and failed, you have to take a 2-day boat from Samoa to actually reach there. There's no airport in the islands. And so what a great example of somewhere where I think the generation cost was nearly $1 on those islands. So clearly very, very expensive. And when they went 100% renewable, which they did achieve, the first thing, or the biggest impact of that, was that islanders for the first time had 24-hour electricity. And that was obviously a huge change, a huge lifestyle change. But what did everyone do? Buy a freezer, because when you're fishing and you happen to have a good catch, if you don't have a freezer, then what are you going to do? And so I think that the demand there doubled within 2 years. That actually doubled the total electricity demand, and so they went back down from that 100%. So there's tons of different examples from islands around the world that are interesting case studies. And okay, a 1,500 person island is very different than a huge utility in the mainland of the US. But there are some interesting lessons in general. And I think this importance, the centrality of energy to all these conversations in the island context is worth paying attention to. And these trends that we're talking about in terms of the diversification towards different types of renewables, the decentralization, and the distributed nature of energy, of electricity generation, make for some interesting reading. But the fundamental lesson is this I think, difference between politics, branding, and reality. And I find myself constantly trying to navigate between all of those to look at what makes the most sense in that island context. So hopefully that was a whirlwind tour around islands from the Pacific to the Caribbean and beyond. Some interesting examples, and be happy to take any questions or comments from anyone watching.